Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AnthroPuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Leila Rodriguez. She graduated with a PhD in anthropology and demography from Pennsylvania State University and is currently an associate professor at the University of Puerto Rico. How are you doing today, Leila?
I'm well, thank you.
Awesome. So I guess my first question is the degrees that you have, so in anthropology and demography, what is demography?
Demography is, depending on how you look at it, either a subdiscipline of sociology or a subdiscipline of statistics. But it's basically the statistical study of population processes, of which the main ones are, fertility, mortality, and in and out of migration.
Okay. So it's kind of like demographics.
That's exactly what it is. It basically studies how the structure and the content of populations change.
Oh, okay. So what is it that you do as an associate professor? What do you research?
So, as you mentioned, right now I'm an associate professor at the University of Puerto Rico, but I've only been there or here, I guess, for about a year and a half at this point. Before that, I was a full professor by the time I left for 15 years at the University of Cincinnati. And then I also taught in various roles as a graduate student at Penn State and also at the University of Costa Rica. And so within this role of being a professor, we do all sorts of things, right? So people think professors teach, and I would argue that that's the least that we do. Obviously, as you mentioned, we research, right? Which means that we create new knowledge about all sorts of topics. If you're lucky, you work at an institution where you can research anything you like. We engage with communities, community organizations. We influence, or try to influence public policy, disseminate content through media. We can be entrepreneurial. We can offer workshops to government, to industry. We serve in all sorts of roles in different committees or, as publishers, as advisors in governance. And so I think for me, the common denominator in all these sorts of roles is how we approach them, right? From academia, meaning that, they're informed by curiosity, especially, of course, to me, that's sort of the anthropological perspective, right? That we're curious, that we're open-minded, but also, through rigorous critical thought and data collection that follows the very strict standards of whatever our fields are. And so I think, I just want to get that out there, that I think in a time where misinformation and disinformation is so easily and so intentionally spread, that I believe in general, this is the main thing that we do, whatever the details of that looks like, whatever we are. And I would say that's true of all my colleagues that you have interviewed so far. But specifically regarding my research, I'm interested in two topics. Ever since I was an undergraduate student at the University of Costa Rica, I was interested in international migration, right? And they say that you study what you are. And so I was an immigrant as a kid. I wasn't, and then I was, and then I came back home. And that had all sorts of effects on my identity and the way that I viewed the world. And so I think that's sort of where some of my curiosity for anthropology stemmed from, but specifically trying to understand this thing, right, called migration. And so that has been something that I've worked on, as I said, ever since I was an undergraduate student. And most recently, my projects look at the local level integration of migrants in local communities, right, including all these different legal and sociocultural dynamics that shape the outcomes both for the immigrants, but also the communities that receive them. And I think my emphasis or my focus within the field of migration studies has changed a lot. It used to be more focused on economic aspects of integration, and I think that relates to the kind of training that I had. But over time, it has shifted more towards, the social construction of that legal or illegal steps. And then for the past 10, maybe 12 years at this point, I've shifted a bit in my agenda, and I researched the use of culture as evidence in legal conflicts, both in the United States and across Latin America. And as most things in anthropology, this came to me by chance or by serendipity. I was fully an immigration scholar, and then a lawyer called my department one year and asked for a Mexican anthropologist, and my department chair sent her my way. I'm not Mexican, first of all. I have conducted research in Mexico, but I didn't know what this meant. She's looking for like an expert in monocultural Mexico, which, as we know, does not exist. And it turns out she was defending a Mexican immigrant in a criminal case, of all things. And she was telling me that she wanted me to be an expert witness to talk about some cultural aspects. And I didn't even know that this was a thing. And so I've been working on that ever since.
Okay, so you basically do like cultural expert witnessing. What does that kind of entail? Like, what are they wanting to hear from you?
Well, that can take a full hour just to talk about that. It's one of the most interesting aspects of this work, I think, trying to bridge that communication gap between the legal system and people who work within the law and then anthropologists, right? But in general, in all these cases, be it criminal cases, land rights cases, in the case of in the context of the United States, this relates to deportation or asylum cases. In general, what we do is inform judges, right, or give judges better context for understanding all the cultural factors, right, or the cultural context within which certain behaviors occur. And I think that's extremely important in culturally diverse societies, right? And so we don't make decisions about the culpability of these people, but we can at least do that. And so I've been asked all sorts of things that are not useful, like, is this person a member of this group? And sometimes, as we know, identity is a matter of self-description as much as identification by others. And so we can speak to some of that, but not all of that. Or we're asked, in the case of asylum, is this person's identity or category something that's discriminated or persecuted in their country of origin? And so to me, those are very interesting because a lot of times it's not obvious that this social category is relevant culturally in a specific society, right? And certain things happen in other contexts that we think from an American perspective, no, that's not going to happen. No, a doctor would never reveal your HIV status to your whole town. Well, in some places it can happen, right? And so we speak to these things. But yeah, so there's a lot of questions that they ask, and some are very difficult for an anthropologist to answer because we work in the gray, right? We're not so good with the black and white, and the law needs black and white. And so, they want to know, is this thing that happened a cultural behavior? I mean, sure, sometimes, that's not sort of the working definition of what culture is, I think, is very different. And we just try to address that in some way.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of anthropologists might relate to this of like when sometimes people ask questions, like you said, they kind of want a black or white answer, especially in like the legal context. But a lot of it is like, well, it depends. So whenever I do, like, people ask me questions about literally any topic and they're like, oh, do you like this or that? Or do you want to go see this? I'm like, well, it depends. Like, it's not like a straightforward answer I can give you because it depends on the situation, what the outcome might be. And I think that's why like anthropologists are especially useful, especially in legal contexts, being diplomats, that kind of stuff, is because they kind of help bridge the gap of the black and white of like, there's that gray middle area of like, oh, well, did you think about it like this? And they're like, oh, no, I didn't.
Yeah. And I think, that the law, like society in general, still implicitly is working with, Edward Tyler's definition from 1871 that culture is this static thing, that you're inside of it or outside of it, and it determines these behaviors, and the content of culture is all the stuff inside culture. And so to me, it's nice to see that, over 140 years, since, as a discipline, we've come so far, and we have these more nuanced understandings that culture doesn't operate that way, but we understand how culture changes, how it shapes, but does not necessarily determine, how it's shared, but not necessarily in its entirety. And it's hard sometimes to explain that nuance and come to just a decision, about this question that they have. But, I feel like it's better to have us try to answer these questions than not have these questions addressed at all in legal contexts.
Yeah. And then with being like a cultural expert witness or participating in that, how do the qualifications or the expertise like vary from like regular expert witnesses of like forensic science or biology and whatnot? Because I know for them, usually they have like CVs that list out their qualifications. Do you kind of have to do the same thing being a cultural expert witness?
Yeah, so in the US legal system, ultimately the person that ratifies you as an expert that's, allowed to speak on these things are the judges in these cases, right? And so I've actually published a little bit about how that works, right? There's this standard, right, called the Dober standard, which very much is written in a way that's considering the hard sciences, right? And so I think the challenge with anthropology is that there's so much epistemological diversity even within our own discipline that we're at these extremes of being more positivist and more critical or interpretivist, and we sort of made peace that we're all somewhere along this continuum, and we're not arguing as much, I think, about this anymore. We just accept that these are all our colleagues in some way. But then to meet this standard of, are we using these methods? Well, I mean, we don't all use the same methods. And yeah, but I think there are definitely ways of signaling to judges that we are experts. And so in my experience, they look to us to have had fieldwork experience, right? If we are intervening in cases with people from other countries or some category of, cultural difference, that we have practical fieldwork experience or publications. And so they'll look at that as well. Like, have you presented at conferences? But I have been cross-examined at trials where I'm questioned, if even that is enough, right? Well, have you talked to people specifically about this thing? And I'm like, well, yes, I did. Well, where in, your data collection did that come up? Well, not necessarily in the data collection, but you just, as an anthropologist, sometimes there's some things that you just know from being in these places, right? And it's hard to pinpoint how you know this. And so, yeah, there are ways of signaling this. Being an expert witness is definitely not something that you can do right out of, your bachelor's, right? It takes some experience and time, but it's still going to be questioned. And I think that's just part of, the way the American common law legal systems work anyways.
Yeah. Do you feel that they don't take you as seriously as like hard sciences do? Because like hard sciences tend to have a lot more quantitative data, whereas the soft sciences in like sociology, psychology, and all that kind of stuff tend to have more qualitative data that they don't feel is as relevant.
I don't know. Nobody has told me this, and and I have not asked about this directly. I will say, in my very, very first case that I worked on, that I mentioned, there was this criminal case. I ended up doing a little bit of a research project to get the information that the lawyer wanted, and I used cultural consensus analysis that I had been trained on this as a graduate student, but it's not a tool that's employed by most anthropologists. I think it's a very relatively small subset of us that have any training on this, and I used it, and I know who the people are who created this technique and have validated it for decades. And so I checked in with them, like, hey, am I interpreting these outcomes or these numbers correctly? And I actually felt very protected on that. It didn't end up being controversial. I wasn't cross-examined, but I thought, if what sometimes happens is that the other side brings their own anthropologist, right, or their own expert, to try to disqualify you. I thought, well, who are they going to find that knows cultural consensus analysis? Is not that many people, and I've already talked to all of them, and I'm good. And so in that case, I did feel very much protected by how sciencey this technique is, right? In the other ones, it has mostly just been about, do you have enough experience? Like, have people actually told you these things, or are you making it up? And you're under oath, so I guess they assume that I'm telling the truth, and I am. But I'm sure that people have their particular reservations about, as you say, the soft sciences. But again, the way that common law systems work is that they are in conflict. Both sides are in conflict with each other, which is very different from civil law. And so no matter who you are, you can be a chemist, they can always bring somebody to try and question your expertise.
Right. Now, do you feel that individuals who are kind of, after you've been working in like the legal system, kind of, do you feel it would be beneficial to lawyers to like take anthropology classes or even like minor in anthropology?
So this is a lifelong project that I have. as I said, I've done this work actively in the United States. I have researched cultural expertise both in the US and across Latin America. Right now, I coordinate a network of people who research and do cultural expertise in Latin America. But I'm also in contact with a similar network in Europe and a smaller network in Australia. And that pretty much covers the whole world of the people who do this. And I kind of know all of them. And so there are some, certificate programs popping up. And I think there's one that's about to be inaugurated in Europe. There's a couple in Latin America. And I think all of us dream with anthropologists and lawyers taking these classes together, because it's very easy for us to mock lawyers, right? That they have these very narrow views of culture, but we also don't have a good understanding of how the law works, I think, and why they sometimes need black and white answers, and why they need answers faster, than year-long ethnographic research will tell. And so yes, absolutely. There are other ways of doing this, right? So I've been very lucky because for the last 3 years, I think, I've been called to give a workshop at the Costa Rican Public Ministry. They have this course that new detectives, I guess equivalent of like FBI detectives, and new district attorneys have to take. And so I'm asked to give a workshop both on the cultural diversity of the country, so that they're familiar with, these are the 8 indigenous, like official indigenous groups, and there's all these other ethnicities and all these other sources of cultural diversity. But I also get to teach them about this tool and, tell them sort of, this is the international context, this is where it's used, and this is how you can use it, and this is how it can help you have a more complete case, I guess, so that better justice can be done.
Okay. Now, do you ever feel like there's like ethical dilemmas when you're speaking on behalf or about a particular group, and depending on what the legal context is in regards to?
Of course, there are a lot of ethical dilemmas. And from my reading internationally, I think we've come to a consensus on what some of these dilemmas are, right? And so I think the first one that some people struggle with is whether we should participate as cultural expert witnesses at all. Because especially in countries with large indigenous populations, but I would argue in general, it's a very sort of band-aid solution to unequal access to justice by cultural minorities in some way, right? And so, sure, we can put in that band-aid, but we really want to, in sometimes make bigger changes structurally to the law, and we don't have the power to do that. And so I think that's one of them. Also, I think sometimes to make things as clear as possible to judges and other sort of recipients of this testimony, we have to commit all sorts of anthropological sins that are not okay in our discipline in other contexts, like essentializing. I mean, sometimes we say, yes, these people do this. And it's like, well, that's not really what we think, but that's the simplest answer that we can give you, right? And there's definitely some of that. There's also the question of, why are we the experts on these cultures and not people from these cultures? And, the answer there is that I think it's a good answer for us that as anthropologists, we possess this toolkit that sometimes we're not explicitly aware of, right? And so, yes, you have to have knowledge of the culture, and we're always going to be a step behind, people who actually identify as being, from this culture. But you also have to understand how the legal system works. You have to be able to translate this culture and interpret this culture for non-experts. And that's something that we know, right? We have to be able to explain things about the culture of these communities, but also sociologically, how these communities are inserted and relate with the rest of society. And, we have to bring theory into it and methods. And so to me, that dilemma is not terrible. Like, this is why I'm doing this, and not somebody, from whatever cultural group or identity that this person holds. But I will say, in some countries like Paraguay, for example, they are training indigenous people to be anthropologists and cultural experts. So that's like the golden ticket, right? So you're an anthropologist, but you're also internal and can speak more to the details and the nuances of the cultural context.
Yeah, I know with archaeology, that is especially what they're trying to push, and trying to get more indigenous individuals involved into archaeology so that when, they go out to digs, they might be able to provide a little bit more of a cultural background to, the items they find or the structures and things like that. Because then they can also kind of contribute to things like NAGPRA and how all of that kind of stuff is going on and how it's affecting them. So I definitely think it's a great idea for those who are interested in anthropology or archaeology or anything like that. If they want to study their own culture, I think they would have a lot of good insight to provide based on their lived experience.
Yes, and I think to that issue as well, this field in general of cultural expertise or cultural expert witnesses, it's called different things in different spaces. It's still pretty new, I think, within legal anthropology, which is great. It's very fertile. As I said, it's increasing and there's, these networks popping up internationally. But one thing that we have not been very good at is trying to get the perspective of people from these communities. Like, how do you feel about the way that we're representing your culture in courts? And there are a couple of cases that I personally know of, but I think we still need to do that, right? Like, we don't have to figure this out on our own. We can just ask them, One more ethical dilemma, it's the money. And I think especially in the United States, this is pretty contentious. And I will say there are people that I know that don't talk because of this. When I first started, in my very first case, I asked around, like, do I know anybody who has done this before? And a couple of my former professors had, and I just thought, well, why aren't we talking about this? Like, at that point, I had never seen a panel at a conference on this, and I organized one. And I don't know if it was the first one, but it was one of the first ones. And I'm very happy to see that this is growing, but we were not talking to each other, right? And so the individuals that I reached out to, I asked about payment. Like, are you paid to do this work? Because it is a lot of time to write these reports, never mind if you have to collect some data, to get this information that they're asking for. And so one of them, I remember a colleague of mine, a former professor, said, well, yes, I charge, and I would say charge at least $150 an hour. He have a PhD. And he said, this is real work, and expert witnesses often get paid for this. And anthropologists seem to be one of the few people who feel like somehow, we're like muddying or dirtying our work if we charge for it. And we have all these, we lose sleep at night, and he's like, charge for it. And I did, because in that case, he was being represented by a court-appointed lawyer. And so there was, the county government had some funds for this. And I thought, well, the county government can pay me a little bit. I am helping them out by trying to bring some clarification to this very complex issue. But beyond that case, every other case that I've worked on have been cases with immigrants. And oftentimes undocumented immigrants, I've worked a couple of cases with unaccompanied minors, and I had, done a multi-year project with unaccompanied minors. And so I knew, not only are they underage, but the financial strain, right? The amount of money that they owe to smugglers and to, families back home, and the family that's hosting them, and they're working minimum wage. And so, and in those cases, every single lawyer made it clear that if I charge, this is something that they're gonna pass my costs down to their clients, right? And so they would not only be paying for the lawyers, which are not cheap, but they would also be paying for me. And so I could never charge for these. I just could not do it. I know people that live off of doing these cases, and they're okay with it. And, I'm not judging them, but I think it's a very personal decision, but it's also a very, I think, controversial stand within sort of the group of people who do this work. Yeah. Like, do you charge? Do you not charge? And how do you make this decision for yourself?
Yeah, that's a hard one because oh man, I don't even know what I would do in this situation. And I definitely know that lawyers aren't cheap.
I don't think the clients feel bad about not paying. I mean, I think they're grateful. And so the way that I see it, I've made peace with it. Is just, first of all, I know myself, and I would just not be able to sleep. Like, and sleep is important to me. I did the other day, I thought, if I had charged what I should charge, how much money would I have now? And I thought, I could get like a nice upgrade, to the vehicle that I drive. But what I tell myself too is, I think there's a lot of ways of, doing activism or like helping out in some way. And so, maybe I'm not donating as much money to charity as I would like to say that I am, or, I'm not out there at every march and every protest, but this is something that I feel comfortable doing as like my way of helping in some way, right? To make society a little bit nicer.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And I think it's amazing. And I think that a lot of people kind of have to, it sucks that capitalism is so driven that we're all like, oh, I need to make money or as much money as I can. But, then you have the individuals like yourself who's like, yeah, but sometimes making that money might be at the expense of like my morals and my beliefs and values and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely a very personal choice that everyone has to make for themselves.
Arguably, it can also challenge that validity to our testimony and our knowledge that you were talking about. I don't have any hard data on this, but I know that it has come up with all sorts of experts that if this is your career, why do we have to trust what you're saying, right? If you're paying me $5,000, or, I would never charge that much, but if you're paying me, a couple of $1,000s to give the testimony, isn't that an incentive for me to say what you want to hear? So that's also, I guess, for me, it's also a way of protecting myself from these challenges to the validity of what's coming out of my mouth.
That's fair. Now, how did you get into anthropology specifically? Because I know you talked a little bit about how you got into like immigration and all that kind of stuff because you're an immigrant yourself. But what kind of led you into the direction of anthropology?
So we have to take a trip down memory lane to my childhood. But I grew up in Costa Rica and Central America in the 80s, which was a very like convoluted time. And, we were okay, but we had 3 civil wars around us. And so these political topics were very much conversations in my house. As I said, I was also an immigrant and then I wasn't, but then I was a person in a country that was receiving a lot of immigrants. And I was like, oh, I get that side too. And I guess just life from an early age put me in a lot of situations where I was able to see both sides of a lot of issues. I started my education in a private French school, and I was sort of like the poorer of the kids in the private school. And then I ended up graduating from a public school, and I was suddenly like kind of one of the wealthier kids in the public school, even though my family's economic status never really shifted. And so I think all of those things just gave me a curiosity about the world and about human diversity, and also just an interest in making society not suck as much, right? And caring about social things. And so in general, I just thought I want to do something to help society, so I have to be a social scientist. Of course, now that's ridiculous looking back. You can make society better from just about any discipline or role that you take. But that was sort of my mentality at the time. I will say, though, I realized, and I don't remember specifically why I chose anthropology. My stepmom is an anthropologist, and maybe looking through her books about all these, like, quote unquote exotic people all over the world, maybe drew me more to anthro than other social sciences. But I remembered exactly the day that I realized I was on the right path, because at the University of Costa Rica, you have to do an entrance exam. And depending on your score, you can get into different disciplines, and you have to declare your major immediately, like my top choice and my second choice, right? And so I thought I want to do anthropology. The evening before I had to declare my major, I was watching this documentary on the TV, and it was about the Ebola virus in Congo. And it was fascinating. And I thought, you know what? I don't want to be an anthropologist. I want to be a microbiologist and work with viruses. And so the next day, I mean, I'm 17. You have to be nice. I'm 17 years old when I'm making these decisions. And so I go to the campus, and I pick, microbiology as my first choice, anthro as my second choice. And my test score was pretty high, higher than the number that you usually needed to get into microbiology. But it seems that the year that I applied for it, somehow that major was very popular, and so I didn't make the cut. And I was so happy the day that I was told, because I realized in the interim that I was making a huge mistake, that the only reason the documentary was fascinating to me was because of the people and how the virus was impacting their lives, and not because I was interested in the dynamics of this little germ, right? And so that's how I got into anthropology. And plenty of people discouraged me. I will say my mom, she didn't discourage me, but I don't think she was that excited, and she tried to push me towards bioanthro because it sounded more sciencey, I guess, and not cultural. I had, a professor a teacher in high school who said I was wasting my university entrance exam because you didn't need such a good score to get into anthro because nobody wanted, you know, very few people wanted to be an anthropologist. And so that's how I became an anthropologist. And I will say, for having to make such an important life decision as a teenager, I've never regretted it, not a single day. And so I was like, yay, 17-year-old me, we're still good. Yeah, because I just love it. So,
Wow. It's always so interesting to hear everyone's story on how they got into anthropology. And half the time it's, oh, we stumbled into it. And it's like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. Because I didn't know what anthropology was till I was an undergrad and I had to take a humanities course. And I'm like, oh, this is pretty interesting. But it was also, I viewed it as a lot more interesting than my business courses where I was taking like accounting and business ethics. And I'm like, gosh, these classes suck. And then I was taking anthropology and it's like rituals of human remains. And I'm like, that's kind of cool. But I did love the people aspect about it. Even though I'm not a big people person, I think I just like observing people and being like, that's cool.
yeah. When I was in Cincinnati, I used to teach, the intro to cultural course for I think every semester. And I always thought the material is so fascinating. The only thing I need to do as a professor is get out of the way. Like just show it and then like remove myself from it because it's just so fascinating and it broadens people's perspectives. And I teach a world anthros class and sometimes we interview anthropologists from all over the world and this is the same thing. It's usually by chance. Usually the parents are not super happy about it, but we're good. We're happy.
Yeah. Now, because you work as a associate professor, do you have any advice that you would give to anyone who's looking to get into grad school?
I do, and I don't want to say too much about it. I will say, I guess, first of all, do what you want to do. Throughout my life, I have met many people who have told me, oh, I wanted to be a historian or an archaeologist, but I played it safe and I studied accounting and they make a lot of more money than I do, but they have that yearning, and I've never had that yearning. I'm like, I'm good. I guess I've met more of those people than people who study anthropology and regret it. And so, I think the financial aspect is a thing. Like, you're probably not going to become a millionaire, but I don't think we're starving. We're okay. I would say choose a program that is a right fit for you, not necessarily the most prestigious sounding university. Similarly, a good advisor is not necessarily a top scholar. I think those are two very different skills, like being great in your area and your research and your publications and being productive versus being able to, take a student and mold them and support them. And students have changed a lot. And so the needs of students, I think, I don't know if there's more now, but we're more aware of them, where students are more vocal about needing other things from us. And so I would say usually emailing other graduate students, a lot of times the emails are public, right? Other grad students will be very honest with you about what it's like to work with different professors. And so, ask like, "Hey, is this person graduating their grad students?" Don't be afraid to contact potential professors that you want to work with. At this point in my career, I have sat at many, many meetings where we're reviewing graduate applications. And, most of the time people are very thorough with reviewing them and we have, tables and rankings and things and comments. But I've also been at tables where, people say, well, this person, anybody heard of them? No. Okay, well, I'm more likely to advocate for somebody that at least I've heard of, by email. And so definitely do that. I will say also don't feel bad about that. The same thing happens to us when we submit, grant proposals and things like that. It's humans at the other end and they don't always do their work great. And so you will definitely increase your odds of getting if you've had conversations with faculty. And I think graduate programs, again, capitalism, right? We get judged by, how many students we graduate. And so I think one thing that we're looking for is this person going to be able to complete this master's degree or this PhD. And you need to be smart to be, to get into, to go to graduate school. But we're all smart enough, right? I think there's all these other things that you need to be. You need to be resilient. You need to like just stick through it. And so we're going to be looking for people who, have done that. Like maybe you didn't have perfect grades, but your grades improved or your letters will talk about how you overcame things and still, finished your degree. And so convince us that you're not going to drop us halfway through. I think that that's also helpful. And to be honest, it was so long ago that I applied for graduate school that I don't want to say too much because I do know that it's very different now. But I think those things are still true. And my final piece of advice, be strong, be resilient, all these things. But if you want to quit, for God's sake, quit. And I don't know if this has changed, but when I was a graduate student, there was such shame around deciding that this is not for you and you're going to leave. And you know what? At the end of the day, you're still you, with or without this degree. It's not the most important thing in the world. And so if you feel like this is not for you, you're okay. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like the shame part of quitting school, I think, has definitely lessened as a society. I think the hardest part in deciding whether or not to quit is how much money you've put into it already. Like if you weren't into like a funded program and you were paying for it yourself, having to like come to terms with, okay, I just spent X amount of dollars and I didn't even get the degree. Should I just keep going? I know that's a struggle for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I guess it's also true that I don't know if I subscribe to this, but I've heard colleagues say it. So I have to think a little bit more about it. But some people say that, the best program that you can get into is the one that funds you the most. At a smaller university where you don't graduate with a ton of debt is ultimately, if you're gonna be good at this, you're gonna be good no matter what the program is. So
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. Well, before we get into our final four questions, is there anything we haven't discussed today in regards to expert witnessing or grad school or anything that you'd like to talk about with the listeners?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's so hard for me to talk about this right now because there's so much uncertainty and shift around like higher education. And,
Mhm.
when I applied for jobs as I was finishing my PhD, people were telling me, "Oh, I feel so bad for you. The economy is just terrible right now. We just came out of like this, like, housing bubble bust, whatever." And I still applied for 40 something jobs. And now I look at it, I'm like, what jobs could I apply for if I was graduating right now? It's not 40 something. It's a lot less, right? And so definitely, there's something about these like alt academic jobs, and I'm ridiculously privileged in that sense that I've done okay. Thankfully, I'm still here, and so I haven't had to consider seriously these alternative academic jobs. But there are, and I know your other people in your podcast can talk about these more. Um, but I will say, once you do get into an academic job, if this is what you want and you get this, it's really hard again, right? You think grad school is so hard, wait until you're into the tenure track, and so I think the same rules apply in terms of finding support, but I think that work-life balance is something that's important. And the way that I've found that is not to try to separate all these different parts of my life, but just to integrate them. And so I think the children of an anthropologist grow up doing field work, like that's just what it is. Bring your kids to to class if you have to. Bring them to, if you're asked to go to this talk at 6 p.m. and you don't have a babysitter or a co-parent or whoever to watch your kid, bring them along. I think that also not every workspace is friendly to you doing that, but to the sense that universities can be, I think it's important to just set these boundaries. Like, if you want me to come, I'm bringing my kid, right? Or no, I'm not doing that, right? Like learning to say no for me was extremely difficult, but it's very important. And people won't hate you; they'll secretly respect you if you say no to things that you don't want to do.
That's valid. So, what is a piece of advice you would offer to someone who wants to get into cultural expert witnessing?
Well, definitely be patient, right? So if you have your bachelor's in anthropology, you are going to most likely need a graduate degree. I would say at the very, very least a master's to be admitted, as an expert to do this work. And I think just get involved. Like I said, there are more networks, more panels, sessions, workshops, and things. Yeah. And so I think it's still a relatively small group of people who do this. And so I think like meeting us and talking through is important. I don't think, again, that this is something that you need to do or you probably don't want to do as your full-time job. And so I think as something to do on the side, I would say definitely develop a CV where you can argue that you're an expert on a specific group of people or culture or, geographic area. Maybe take a few law classes. I think that's important. And yeah, just be ready because US courts are a little bit of a boxing match. And so you have to have a bit of a thick skin. Yeah. The first time I was cross-examined by a Department of Homeland Security attorney was not the most fun evening of my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I could imagine so. I work for the district attorney's office, releasing discovery to public defenders and private attorneys. And sometimes it can be a lot, like depending on what the case is and, those involved. And there's like so many moving parts that sometimes I feel bad for the attorneys on their caseload, because we've had days where the public defenders, especially, where they'll switch cases over to a different public defender. And I've had a day where like one public defender got like 120 new cases. And I'm like, how do you process all of that? Yeah.
I think the emotional aspect of this is hard. I've had one time, it was the clients that reached out to me and they said, can you work with my lawyer? It wasn't the lawyer that reached out. It was the client. And they'll tell you their life story. And it's hard because you want to do right by them. And I think also you have to remember, like, you're not the person making this decision, right? So it's not up to me whether this person gets deported or not. And it shouldn't be. And it shouldn't be about me deciding whether you get to stay or, I wear my heart on my sleeve. And I think all immigrants, I mean, it's not about that, right? Just think about it as the law is complicated, as you say, public defenders especially, but probably all lawyers have, large caseloads, and the legal system is complex and it's scary and it's hard to navigate as a PhD. I can't imagine as, people who might not be as familiar with sort of these institutionalized sort of formalities and processes. But at the end of the day, I think to me, what makes this work worthwhile. I don't usually know what happens to these clients. Sometimes the lawyers will tell me, sometimes they don't. Usually the cases that I work on is one, but there's going to be appeals on either side. And so, 10 years down the line, who knows what the final decision was. But you're just trying to make things a little bit more fair, right? And making sure that these very critical decisions that judges have to make about people's lives are made with more complete information.
Right. Now, are there any changes that you'd like to see in the industry?
Oh, well, in the court system, I mean, there's also different court systems, right? I mean, the immigration law or the immigration court system, I would start by having actual judges because, judges in immigration courts are not actual judges. They're people appointed by the executive branch. And so I think that already is extremely, extremely. So yes, there's plenty of changes that I would like to make. But it is possible in other countries, like in Colombia, for example, cultural expertise has been employed in cases not just with indigenous people, but also sexual minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. And over time, my colleagues there tell me that it has led to some constitutional changes of how law is done in general, right? And so that structural change that we all like to see can happen, but it's not easy.
With how complicated our judicial system is and how everyone has they want to be right and they want it done their way, and there's a lot of people who don't want to give and whatnot, it can definitely make changes a lot harder, but that doesn't mean they're impossible. It just might take a lot of work and a lot of patience and a lot of people. Definitely not a one-person job to try and make those changes. Now, is there anything that you just absolutely love about your job and the work that you do?
Specifically about my job, I would say just the flexibility of the work, right? And so, being an academic, even now that we're, under attack, I think it's such a privileged job, first of all, because of the flexibility in schedule, right? So as long as, and I know this varies by institution as well, but I think in general, if you show up to your classes and your meetings and at the end of the semester, you did all the things you had to do and then some, nobody really cares like where you're at every minute of the day. And I've had jobs where I do feel like I'm being watched, and I'm on the clock. And so I think that flexibility for me is important, right? And so sometimes, if my daughter has something at school on a Monday morning, I'm going to show up. And, if I don't feel great this day and I don't have to teach, I'm going to stay home. The flip side, of course, is that, yes, I've had to work Saturdays at 2 a.m. to finish a deadline, but I'm in control, right? Mostly. But also just flexibility in terms of the actual tasks that you do, right? And so I get to teach different classes. And I don't get bored, or even if I do the same class, I'll change it up a bit, right? And I get to research anything that interests me. And so some days I'm mostly on campus teaching, and other days I'm doing field work, or I decided to join this committee or not join this committee, or get involved in one of my professional organizations or not, or now I'm going to go hang out and give workshops to the community. And so that also for me just keeps the job constantly interesting. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the things that to me is the best, I guess, about having this, that you don't just have to teach. You can really do anything from this title of being a professor, right? And so that's in general for like the academic side of things. That I'm an academic, but I've also done a lot of non-academic work, right? Not just the legal stuff, but I've done consulting jobs for businesses. And so I'll do a little, they're not my favorite, but yeah, like I'll help you out with this problem. And then I do charge them. But I think also just for anthropology in general, I think to me is the ability to live many lives. Like when I was a kid, I thought I wanted to be an actress because I love the idea that I'm going to be this. And then in a few months, I'm going to be, living a different life. And I feel like I'm not an actress, but anthropology gives me that, right? Like I've seen the world through so many people's eyes, and I don't always agree, but it's pretty fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that with anthropology, it should definitely be taught earlier, like elementary school, high school level, because I think that with how diverse just even the United States is, let alone the whole world is, that I think it's beneficial to individuals to interact with individuals who aren't like them, because I think it would make solving problems and understanding other people's perspectives so much easier if you understand other individuals who aren't like you.
Oh, absolutely. It needs to be taught K to 12. And there are anthropologists working on that, but
Things crossed. Now, finally, so where can listeners learn more about you or what you do if they wanted to get into contact?
well, they can follow me on LinkedIn, and I'm working on having a website. I've never I don't get around to completing it, but that will be linked there as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, I had a great time chatting with you, and also learning about a new kind of career path that anthropologists can take, because it wasn't one that I had really considered as something that existed. Because I know expert witnesses exist and like forensic anthropologists do that all the time, but I didn't really think about it from a cultural perspective. So I think it's really cool, and I hope a lot of individuals who listen to this are like, oh, that's a new path that I can take, and then we have a lot more of those in the world.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. I do hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thanks, you too.
All right. Bye. Thanks for listening to another episode of AnthroPuzzled. This show was produced by me and distributed in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website, L. Akers for the incredible logo design, and to AnthroPuzzled's intern Fiona for the episode descriptions. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound and Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letzinger@anthropuzzled.com or as AnthroPuzzled on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time.